So this week on the Encrypted Economy, we had Kevin McCarthy of Inpher on the show. Not only did I want to give the listeners the ability to learn what Inpher is doing in the privacy-enhancing technology space, homomorphic encryption, secure-multiparty computation, etc., but I also wanted to come at it from the business development side, which Kevin heads up for Inpher. Now, Kevin, with a career background that includes McKinsey, has a deep understanding of the technology. He also has had a slightly different angle than my prior guests, in that his focus is in finding and nurturing the use cases for privacy-enhancing technologies. It's often a challenge to introduce disruptive technologies, and Kevin's breakdown of it is illuminating not only for privacy-enhancing technologies, but really any disruptive tech. He does a great job as to who his prospects are and how they're viewing this. I feel like business schools should be replaying this as part of their curriculum, and maybe I can get a royalty on that. Anyway, we also pick up on the theme of edge computing and tying it back to the privacy-enhancing technologies that are deployed. We also discuss how data can be leaked, even in an encrypted environment, and what that means for the anonymization of data, or what we commonly believe to be the anonymization of data. We end by discussing how the pet space gets to demonstrate what it can do, whether in competitions, tech sprints, and also, more importantly, what those teach us about privacy-enhancing technologies. I continue to be amazed at how much there is to cover with regards to privacy-enhancing tech, and how it's this relatively quietly developing story that is going to change so much of what's possible in data science and business. 5 years' time, it's going to seem absurd for data-focused organizations not to have adopted these techs. It'll be a competitive disadvantage, yet today it still feels relatively young and maybe a little out there. At any rate, I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Kevin a lot. Listen to this episode, and if you haven't already, go back and listen to Hemenway Falk, Kurt Rohloff, and Ellison Anne Williams' episodes. If this is a space that interests you, we have the content, and a lot more to come too. As always, if you like the show, tell us. Tell your colleagues. Give us stellar reviews. And with that, I bring you the episode with Kevin McCarthy. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, where we look at the business of, regulation, and security for all things encrypted, digital assets, blockchain technology, privacy, and smart contracts. Hope you'll join us while we explore these forces that are shaping the economy. So this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy, and I'm really excited to have Kevin McCarthy. He's the head of business development over at Inpher. Before we started this podcast today, Kevin and we started talking. We're like 40 minutes into it. We're like, we should get this podcast going. So this is following 40 minutes of discussion, and it's great to talk with him and share his perspective. Now, Inpher is a leader in privacy-enhancing technologies. Kevin's going to talk more about that, but I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to talk a little bit about his background and how his background led to his journey to Inpher.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, it's great to be here. This will be fun. As you mentioned, I lead growth and BD at Inpher, really helping map privacy preserving computations, what we call secret computing, into some of the advanced analytic needs in the privacy preserving world. My background's always been in and around the information analytics space, really from starting my career at UBS to some time in a family business to consulting at McKinsey and an interesting startup before Inpher called Demist. I think personally what's always been my interest in this is information arbitrage, at least starting out in the days back at UBS. The people with more information, more timely information seem to win, particularly in the markets. And growing up in and around a data business and a data family, I always thought the information arbitrage that was available through cobbling together unique, disparate assets of data could help you know more, do things better. And that's really held true kind of into what I do today at Inpher, helping people leverage secret computing technology to compliantly, permissibly gain access to data to power some of their needs. So that's my quick story on who I am, where I'm at. I'm coming to you from lockdown California, in COVID state with work from home, parent from home. So balancing the desire to work on growing a startup, but also work on maintaining a sane family is the driving factor today. But it's great to be here. This is awesome. And I love the podcast and what you're working on with the folks you have on, and also just kind of building a talk track around this. What we'll probably discuss, and what I think I've heard you chat a little bit about in some of your early podcasts, is this is a small space. 9 out of 10 people have never heard of some of the things we'll probably talk about. And so the opportunity to bring it out a bit in the light, a bit in the open, and particularly off the page through a podcast and through discussion is appealing and intriguing. So thank you for having me on.
We're excited to have you on. This is going to be a great episode. So I warned you in advance. Everybody who comes on the show now, I ask them about a singular personal experience. It's a story, right? That either helped shape your values, your worldview, your perspective.
The world is a big place. I had the great opportunity when I was in college back at Bucknell to go on a thing called Semester at Sea, which really transformed and shaped my worldview. Not only did I meet my wife on it, but I had the chance when I was in my young 20s to visit 10 different countries in a matter of 100 days and live there while I was there. And growing up in South Florida and really being an American citizen, you don't get outside of your bubble too often. And taking a boat around the world to places like Venezuela during the Hugo Chavez days, or traveling to South Africa with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and even getting into Myanmar during the junta days, which is now apropos and quite timely given what's happening with Aung San Suu Kyi, and the same thing all over again, opened my eyes to the fact that the world is bigger than America, or bigger than just your place that you grew up in. And that's challenged me to want to continue to learn more, new cultures, new people, new places. So I think that's been pretty transformative in my worldview. But I guess in terms of bringing it to Inpher and a bit more technical, it was probably on some of those travels that I found that moving and bringing together information was a difficult thing to do. Particularly during my consulting days, we would fly around and collect a lot of encrypted hard drives to bring them back to a central place to analyze for better healthcare analytics at the time. And at one point, I think one of our team members put encrypted hard drive in the mail with a Post-it note on it with the password. And that was inefficient and a huge threat vector, and it had lots of people's PHI on it, and there had to be a better way than flying around with encrypted hard drives or shipping data the way that we were, to make more intricate, deeper analytics possible. And I think, at least for what we're doing at Inpher today, there's great relevance into solving that problem. And that was just an example that probably repeated itself all over my career in the professional side, that it's very difficult to properly and compliantly bring together disparate data sets. And I think secret computing and kind of what we're doing these days solves for some of that. And so, big world, lots of data that continues to accelerate and grow. And I guess that's kind of my personal experience that's probably shaped my outlook on what I do on a day-to-day.
So I'm just going to ask this question. So when you started your travels at sea, those first few days, were you leaning over the edge of the boat at any point? Or was it, because, being at the sea for a while, it can make you seasick, right? Until you get your sea legs anyway.
Well, it sounds more sailing than it was. This was an academic institution run by the University of Virginia, where they essentially took a 700-foot cruise ship and ripped out the casino and shops and put in a library and classrooms. So it's a big boat, but when you're rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 25-foot seas, you still rock and roll, batten down the hatches. But to date myself, actually, the best part about it was we were in South Africa at the point a cruise ship going into Mombasa, Kenya, was first attacked by pirates. I think this was back in 2005. We didn't really know too much about the concept of pirates in the Indian Ocean. We now do, thanks to Tom Cruise and a bunch of interesting movies, Tom Hanks, I guess. But we got stuck there and didn't get to go to Kenya. We were transferred over to Mauritius. And even in a big boat traveling around the world, you run into a lot of issues. But sea legs weren't the hardest one. It was more, what are we going to do when we get to South Africa for 10 days? Or what are we going to do in Japan? Where are we going to go? What are we going to explore? What are we going to see? That was more tricky part, but also the fun part.
I wonder how well those programs do in the post-COVID era. Certainly the cruise ships got a lot of attention early on, but this is not a podcast about that. So we actually rarely mention the words COVID on this podcast. So with that said, we've had Hemenway Falk. We've had Ellison Anne Williams from Enveil. We've had Kurt Rohloff from Duality on the show, but now we have Inpher. So you want to tell us a little bit about what Inpher focuses on, and let's hear a little bit about what you're working on today there.
Yeah, absolutely. You've had a rock star cast of colleagues in the space. And so what we do at Infer is similar but a little different. We call ourselves a secret computing company. So secret computing for us is privacy preserving machine learning and analytics. And underneath that are a range of different capabilities. I know we'll talk about like secure multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, federated learning, and the list goes on. Really, it's about making privacy preserving analytics usable and possible for data scientists at enterprises within their existing workflow. That means we're a software as a service business working with banks, financial institutions, insurers, telcos, and some life science and healthcare shops that really have high bars to compliant, permissible use of data, but also deep sophistication in their analytics or predictive modeling. So generally speaking, we're working with data science teams that are analyzing deeper and more robust data sets for better outcomes in fraud detection, marketing and customer treatment, patient selection, and augmented diagnostics, and even some stuff in the predictive maintenance and defense area. So we're a team split across 3 primary domains today: New York, Lausanne, Switzerland, and San Francisco. But the team of 30 is all, like everyone else, working from home or from a unique location. And we continue to plug away on more, better, faster. At the core of the business is a platform that compiles a range of different privacy preserving techniques that make it so that a user can compute on data while it remains encrypted. And the encrypted side of the house is not so much about keeping your data secure and private, but it's more about what you can do when your data is guaranteed to be secure and private.
That's a very important point, I think, because it really goes to the potential for the business as opposed to just looking at it as sort of a compliance technology.
No doubt. And we get caught up a little bit into that dilemma in early intros with new organizations to this technology, but I think we land it a lot of the times with a value-driven approach, generally pointed at places we can prove value today. So that's kind of the mantra behind existing models with high precision needs. If you can take an existing model and improve it, the value that accrues is relatively tangible, meaning if we have a fraud detection model and it's more precise, we can stop fraud. If we have a marketing model and it's more precise, we can better target customers, et cetera. And that's a lot of what we do today. But I think what excites us in terms of the long-term value is enabling the development of models that can't exist today or don't exist today because of the issues around data access and aggregation that would be required to overcome to make it possible. So a lot of focus on improving and showing value in this technology today with existing analytic workflows, but some early work in terms of developing advanced analytics on data sets that couldn't be put together because the threat vector is just too great when you put your financial and life science and genetics and healthcare data all together in one central repository.
I think it's mind-bending for heads of industries to think about the possibility of being able to collaborate with adversaries, which is really what these technologies do. I talk on other podcasts about confidentiality agreements, but confidentiality agreements are never 100%. And how do you unknow something? How do you unsee something? Like we stress about this, like, we'll never use it. Everything's protected, but people are looking at this stuff. It's supposed to be confidential. They're looking at it. They're ingesting it. They can't unsee it, and they take the value with it. But with this technology, it just cracks that wide open because it is 100% guarantee. Confidentiality agreement, you might say 99%, you might say 90%, you might say 80%, you might say 50%, but it'll never be 100%, right?
Yeah, it's hard to benchmark a percent on anything. We, at least at Infer, the terminology we kind of talk about is paper-based protections versus mathematical proofs. And perhaps the math is a more elegant approach to guaranteeing privacy because we have mathematical proofs to privacy. Paper-based protections, whether they be non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements, test data, sample data agreements, the list goes on, is difficult. It's based on trust, it's based on paper, and even though it's written on that paper, it can still go wrong. Leveraging some math or crypto allows us to have a slightly more elegant approach to guaranteeing that privacy or that confidentiality. And in terms of the adversaries collaborating, I think that's still to be seen. There's unique dynamics it brings back into some of these previously evaluated and almost bungled data sharing or data collaboration projects that seem to be getting dusted off and reevaluated all over the place when new technology like secret computing or pets come along. There's this kind of competitive dynamic that starts to take shape in collaborating over IP, namely the data that a company has collected. So far, we've seen more of the adversarial collaborations in pre-competitive use cases, things like fraud detection and anti-money laundering, where more of the intrinsic customer acquisition or service collaborations are more truly collaborative. So not so much like-minded institutions, but differing entities like a bank and a telco or a bank and an insurer versus multiple banks themselves. And I think that one is still shaping out, but so far it's been more pre-competitive use cases in the adversarial space and not so much the opposite.
And so you're on the front line, you're talking to the prospects, and it's really be interesting to hear your perspective on the different groups, the different mindsets in how where's the education level, where are the pushbacks, who's getting it, who's not. I know there's a lot in there. I'll leave it to you to unpack it.
That's the challenge in the role, no doubt. Education and awareness is a huge one, and people fall into a bunch of different camps. I'd probably start to think about them in 4 primary buckets. Generally, though, 9 out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100, this is a very new concept. So we do have to take a different shape when introducing ourselves and Inpher. Namely, the concept of computing on encrypted data is kind of the first question. Have you heard of this? There's a great spectrum, even on your podcast, of people in the privacy enhanced technology space that have never heard of it before to having their PhD and spending their whole career in it. And the level at which each of them have understanding is very ranged. And that holds at our customers and our prospective customers too. So we have to very quickly kind of diagnose where they're at in their journey of privacy enhanced technologies, and then stack a bunch of content behind it to support both ours, third party, regulatory, think tank, et cetera. I think at some point you come across folks that sit somewhere in the middle, both in a beneficial and almost a detrimental side. The beneficial is there's more of this analytical interest, at least for us at Inpher, that have clear understanding of kind of some of the problems that this could solve for them in their day-to-day, and they're business minded and focused on outcomes. There's the second camp where there's more interest in the technology itself, meaning the desire to deeply understand the technology and compare and contrast amongst one another without a business goal or end in mind. Trying to diagnose and then treat both of those different camps appropriately is also kind of the second level of criticality for us. There's a wrinkle of a third camp somewhere in there in terms of the CISOS, perhaps blockchain community, and even the DeFi community that anytime we talk about cryptography always wants to immediately jump to cryptocurrencies. And to be frank, we don't do too much in the DeFi cryptocurrency space at Inpher. We're very much more focused on the kind of the classic bread and butter of analytical data science teams. But there's always a question of who's holding the keys in an MPC manner, or how does this work with a blockchain network that starts to miss the point. And we know we haven't really done our job of sharing too well of what we're doing at Inpher to kind of go down that path. But differing camps all over the board. General inhibition in the market is, I think a lot of people don't know that you can compute on data while it remains encrypted. And it's at least small wins, it's a very fun experience to be with clients, particularly at a senior level, when that light bulb moment happens, when there's clear understanding of a known capability to compute on data in an entirely crypted space. Light bulbs start going off and the ideas start flowing rather quickly. And it takes a different shape to start to kind of constrain, well, we could do this with it. We could do this with it. We could do that with it. What else should we do with it? Well, there are trade-offs. One, which we probably should talk about, there's incremental compute. It's harder to compute on data while it's encrypted. You can't do everything just yet. There's some performance limitations. All of that is being addressed and worked on by us and a bunch of other shops in the space. But the light bulb moment is really fun when you're taking people from kind of that uninitiated, unaware side of the camp into perhaps the middle where they want to start mapping it to some of their business goals. And I spend a lot of my time personally, probably with that second stage of people trying to map this into solving some well-known historical problems or needs in regulated analytical industries like finance or healthcare.
And when you talk about the compute limitations, I mean, in how many use cases do you actually hit those compute limitations? In other words, is the intended use so dependent on computational power or real-time data? I was talking to Ellison Anne about that, and she said, listen, we don't have that issue because for the use cases that most people are looking at, that real-time compute, that microsecond doesn't exist. So most use cases actually, for this data, for what the current compelling use cases are, this isn't really even necessarily a limitation.
I would agree with it. We're not talking about high frequency hedge funds trading on encrypted data today. And we're probably not going to be. And that comment from Ellison is spot on because of the work that folks like Inveil and Inpher and Intel and whoever else is working on speeding this all up have made possible. There are still overheads and there are still limitations, particularly when you start to tie privacy enhanced technologies with AI or machine learning or data science. So if you take a relatively cumbersome workload like machine learning training and you add encrypted overhead to it, you do start to see some upper bounds, whether it be memory, runtime, bandwidth, but you constrain that down to use cases that don't require it. So are we training a model every minute or are we training a model once a day, once a week? Are we running inference with an SLA of under 2 seconds, or do we have a SLA of a millisecond? Not only does that define the solution space, but it also starts to dictate what technology is most relevant for that use case. And so mapping the need for the privacy enhanced technology into the business requirements is a lot of what happens today. And we focus on building a capability that abstracts some of that cryptographic requirement, cryptographic insight that's needed to bring the right privacy enhanced technology into that problem. So in certain circumstances, you could use fully homomorphic encryption for a basic operator. You could use secure-multiparty computation for some model training. And then you could use differential privacy on the back end to kind of protect on the outputs. What we kind of champion at Inpher is that the solution is typically not a either or. It's very much an and type privacy need, meaning you need a multitude of privacy enhanced technologies to kind of meet the greatest business need. So I think from maybe back to one of your early questions where we kind of differentiate, we don't like to focus on one specific privacy enhanced technology versus the capability suite. So we don't often get into the horse races of this FHE versus the other, or this approach for MPC versus the other. A lot of it is, it can be both. It can be either or. And our software is actually quite apropos in being named XOR, so it could be an exclusive or as well.
Then, it's interesting. You talked about the computational overhead of machine learning. And in many ways, that's really a function of the existing high computational overhead of machine learning, meaning you're already consuming a lot of resources as it is. So anything incremental on it, it's going to be challenging. On one of our episodes, we had Igor Mezic, who's done a lot of work with the Koopman operator, which is sort of an alternative machine learning that does not have the computational overhead. In fact, we get into a lot about the added dimensionality of time in the podcast. Again, I am going off a little bit on a tangent, but it's intriguing when you think about how that kind of technology, the use of the Koopman operator, could actually work even better with PET technologies than the existing cumbersome, heavy machine learning, because it adds the additional dimensionality of time in a way that machine learning really doesn't do. As he said, machine learning isn't learning at all. I know there'll be some disputes about that, but what the heck, I threw it out there. So you guys had a recent win with Coronami, and we were talking a little bit about the customer journey. And to use that as sort of an example, let's talk about that announcement, what it means, where they saw the swim lanes, what's really driving those decisions.
Coronami is a really interesting California chip organization working on some next generational capabilities to speed up not only fully homomorphic encryption, but also just general purpose machine learning or other computationally intensive workflows. Not so much a win, but mostly a partnership in terms of collaboration on accelerating FHE to a state that some customers are starting to require it. The work that Coronami is tackling is some of the more impressive stuff we've seen. And we're always trying to figure out where we can move past barriers of compute performance today, both with existing capabilities, but also future capabilities. And I think a lot of that comes from some recent, a lot of it comes from organizations trying to push the boundaries on this, namely DARPA as a good example. So the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency working on some efforts to encourage collaboration between hardware and software organizations to make FHE no slower than one order of magnitude from plain text. So there's probably a bunch that's been said. FHE used to be 1 trillion times slower than plain text. Now it's gotten a lot faster. And the goal is to bring it to something no more than 10 times slower than plain text. And what that requires is kind of new silica. There are a couple of organizations like Intel and Galois that are starting to work with DARPA on that. But also what we found is there are existing capabilities in the market or coming to market that can already speed it up. One of which is just GPUs, right? So using some capabilities from places like NVIDIA or others to speed up some of the fundamental capabilities to make FHE possible, to also working with organizations that are building new chips like Coronami to make parallelizing and pipelining operations very efficient. And I think we see some great interest in accelerating that journey beyond, I think, kind of the DARPA 5-year timeline to bringing faster homomorphic encryption to market sooner. And our collaborations with Coronami kind of go in that direction. I have great excitement about not just our collaboration with Coronami, but also advanced chip capabilities to contemplate encrypted AI workloads and build for those coming workloads as we and the market develops.
And when we talk about the future, I think another topic that I was hoping to mix up with you a little bit that we talked about earlier was when we think about, there's a lot of talk about encryption. Everybody knows, or people probably listening to this podcast better know by now if they listen to the previous ones, there's encryption at rest, there's encryption in transit, and then there's the concept of encryption in use now because of homomorphic encryption technology advances and multi-party computation advances, et cetera, zero knowledge proofs. We talked a little bit about the state where the data is protected in use, meaning the environment that fully homomorphic encryption or these PET technologies are now being implemented in are being applied or overlaid into organizations on existing data sets, on existing applications, on existing environments. But there's also the edge component of all this and how these technologies have the potential now or will now have the need to integrate with the edge. Because, in fact, when we talk about encryption in use being the last mile, it may not actually be the last mile to the extent that there are gaps between encryption in transit and encryption in use, or encryption at rest and encryption in use. So any of those gaps that exist present a potential vulnerability. and love to hear your thoughts about ways that the edge can integrate in with the pet technologies.
Well, it's kind of like a pendulum. To some extent, it seems like data flows flow to the edge and flow to the middle, back and forth. You could think about that from like mainframes to PCs to clouds to 5G IoT, kind of going back and forth between the mainframe out to the PC edge, back to the data center cloud. And now we're talking about moving more compute back to the edges. It very much feels like today we're in that centralized cloud repository, tons of workloads in the cloud. But as we start to talk about 5G and more IoT, well, that takes us back to the edge. That's kind of where I think the pendulum will start to swing again. Today, given where the data resides and where therefore the data needs to be protected and secured, a lot of the pet focus is probably more so on the data center or on the cloud, given that's where the data is. But as it starts to move to the edge, we're starting to see desires to move compute, encrypted compute out to the edge, but also encrypted collection of data out at the edge. Thinking about that in two highlighted capabilities, you kind of could probably want to bring up FHE and maybe even more federated learning. Well, not a privacy preserving technique, but more of an approach to keep data local out at the edge. With federated learning, we've got data sets like your cell phone generating predictive text for Swift or swipe, keeping the data on your phone in plain text while it resides on your phone. We can train the model and keep it out there. So we're training the models kind of out on the edge from a machine learning perspective. So the benefit there is we're bringing compute to your device versus data from your device to the compute. I think there's some interesting applications there. Definitely the swipe and predictive text stuff from Apple and Google are popularized, but we're seeing that really federated concept probably start to hum in more of the health or life sciences with patient monitoring and a range of different sensitive devices in the healthcare space. I think on the other side, you probably want to start to think about like FHE, encrypting at the point of generation at the edge. So if we can secure that data when it's generated through a fully homomorphic encrypted process, well, then we kind of minimize that threat vector of it being in plain text while it's generated. But it feels like some similar concepts around the onboarding of data onto a ledger. Right? So if I can tie a parallel to blockchain, there's similar issues. Once we get the data on the chain, it's great, it's immutable, it's there. But how do we trust the data as it kind of comes onto the chain? You'll have a similar, perhaps, dilemma with encrypted computation at the edge. But I see a lot of that happening. I think it's very early, but it plays, again, back into some of the early DARPA interests where they are kind of putting out some interesting problem statements of trying to run inferencing on an image in untrusted domains. So can we run image detection on someone's cell phone without that image being seen or being moved, but do it in a relatively constrained compute environment, maybe your cell phone or a different handheld device? A lot to happen. Feels though like a pendulum. Most of our activity to date at Infer is more centered on the centralized larger repositories of data that have already been collected and have needs to be protected and then monetized. I think the next evolution is moving it more towards the edge, but that's also just the next evolution of IoT and 5G as well. So we're probably just following pace right behind it, maybe a couple of years or so.
And we also talked a little bit before about the other end of that, which is homomorphic encryption protects the data that's inputted, the data that is homomorphically encrypted. But then there's also the epsilon factor. And I'll leave that to you to explain.
Yeah, well, homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation. So privacy enhanced technologies generally are about preserving the privacy of data, of input data, and guaranteeing that nothing but the output of a function can be seen. Now, that's fantastic and it protects the input data and preserves its privacy or confidentiality. But what if I can deduce and learn things about that data through the functions I might ask of it? And Eric, I gave you an example. If I can ask a min or a mean about a salary, on an encrypted salary, I can eventually learn and narrow my way in on that salary. So if your salary is $100, I could ask a function of that encrypted 100, is it above 99 or below 101? Once I get that answer, I eventually know the input data. So you can kind of deduce it and leak it. And this concept often popularized in differential privacy around epsilon and information leakage. At least at Infer, we think about that more on the backside about preserving the privacy of the inputs by restricting some of the quantity or type of functions that can be run on a data set, almost called timeout, so that you're not deducing the underlying data. More often, I think people think about differential privacy as a privacy preserving mean itself, injecting noise into a data set to perturb it so that results can't deduce the inputs. Things like k-anonymity and really DP play into this space. But when you do that, you start to lose accuracy, lose precision in the result that you might achieve. And unfortunately, for a lot of the use cases we work on at Infer, that noise, that perturbance of a result has detrimental outcomes. It could break a machine, kill someone, or prescribe the wrong medication. So we very much at least operate in this high precision privacy preserving world and use the differential privacy frameworks to overlay on the back end of what you learn through an encrypted computation. Are you allowed to learn it or not? And I think that's one of the more evolving areas in the pet arena, kind of hybridizing and layering these technologies together. That also makes me even think about the last example we were talking about at the edge and with federated learning versus fully homomorphic encryption. Actually, what we're seeing in real world use cases is people are blending those two, specifically at the secure aggregation level. So while federated learning has been quite popularized to keep data local and private on devices, what unfortunately happens is when you send a gradient, the initial learning from that data set outside of the existing device, you start to learn things and deduce things from that gradient. A lot of times it's susceptible to model inversion, so you can kind of go in and learn the data set. And more recently, regulators are starting to look at those gradients themselves as a form of pseudo anonymization of data, which starts to make it stay resident in a certain country or a certain domain like Europe because of GDPR. And so you then need to take these federated learning concepts and layer on pets like homomorphic encryption or secure multi-party computation to preserve the privacy in a holistic manner. Again, back to a bit of what we see, at least in terms of the market and the use case requirements, being a lot of hybridization of pets, and the debate still largely on one pet versus another, when it seems that the implementations are a lot more 1 + 1 is equaling 3.
And when we talk about epsilon, listeners may think, oh, this is sort of a pet concept, right? And this is something that exists in the pet space. It exists all over any data business. When you do a data contract and the other side says, your information is confidential, but we can use any metadata or resultant data, you have to pay attention. This is not 1990s. This is not 2000. This is not 2010 anymore. That metadata is more valuable than your underlying data itself because it can be predictive in a way that your underlying data on its own can't be. So I think to the uninitiated, these contracts are facilitating handing over the keys to the treasure chest, because having access and leveraging that metadata, who cares about your underlying data? We get everything we need. Like, I don't need your underlying data. I can figure out what you're going to do tomorrow anyway. In the trading sense or what have you, it's almost irrelevant because it's almost like, hey, we got the model we need right out the gate. Why do we need the underlying data? It's yours. Great. But we get all the value out of it. I think it's a concept not unique to pets. It's something that anybody in the data space, whether or not you have the privacy enhancing technologies, and increasingly you're going to need to think about that. But irrespective, you're going to need to think about, what does that actually mean when another party is gaining access to your resultant data? It's aggregated and anonymized, you see in these data contracts. So I tell my clients, it's like, you know what aggregated and anonymized means? Nothing. It means nothing anymore. So
I hope people are getting over the concept of anonymization. And there's some great research topics out there that anonymization is dead. And I'd love for folks to kind of bend their mind a bit to that. If you're getting told the story that your data is being anonymized, you need to pressure test that, because it is a lot more difficult to anonymize your data than one might think. I mean, removing your name and address and gender doesn't cut it. Hashing it or even salting it really doesn't cut it, because when I can start to layer whatever data set in with existing or, more interestingly, exposed hacked data sets themselves, we really can start to do these layering attacks to deduce who an individual or an entity is within a previously thought anonymous data set. And so a lot of good enough solutions today perhaps rely on some paper-based controls and anonymization, but I think the conceptualization of an anonymity being relatively trivial to debunk is growing. And there are some really fun papers and even kind of websites out there where you enter in just your name, your zip code, and one or two features. They'll start to really give you the precision of you're one of one people based on what you told us, that we can figure out who you are. I'm not so certain about it, but I think your earlier comment starts to bring up the whole analogies of, is data the new oil? What is the metadata? Who has the value? I forget who it was on one of your earlier podcasts was talking about data as the new plutonium.
That was Kurt Rohloff.
Tended to like that, given all of the other implications of holding, controlling, using, storing plutonium. Feels pretty common to some of the ways we think about the value and risk of holding data, almost like a game of hot potato.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's the regulatory implications, but there's also the fact that you're a target. There's the fact that if you are a target, that the edge that you think you have may not be the edge you have. If in fact you're not protecting it, it could actually be used against you. So in many ways, collecting all that data and having it as the basis for your decision making, to the extent that you're not protecting it, it's radioactive to you, because if you're dependent and that's your business, there's a lot of different implications about the way it could be plutonium. So I also want to talk about iDash, the Super Bowl of advanced encryption and the categories. So do you want to talk a little bit about what iDash is and how they choose their winners and how you guys did in it? It'd be very intriguing.
Yeah, iDash is fun. I might call iDash the Kaggle of our little slice of the world, and maybe Kaggle the Super Bowl of data science.
Okay.
But essentially, it's a
definition of Kaggle.
Kaggle's a great Google Google tool to benchmark data science capabilities. It's really fun.
Okay.
How data scientists show off, I guess, these days. And iDash is just that for how cryptographers and privacy enhanced technologies show off. Once a year, the International Genomics Imputation event occurs, funded by some NIH grants, and really is a forum of academics, corporates, and individuals that come together to compete on some common tasks. This year, there were three primary tasks: a fully homomorphic focused one, a secure enclave focused track, as well as a federated learning track, which are all pointed towards healthcare use cases to standardize the ask, compute on this data with this problem statement in mind, and develop these results. So Inpher competed and continues to do so every year for a couple of years now. Inpher took home first track in, I think, 2 first and third track, for which the first was fully homomorphic cancer prediction or tumor detection. What essentially that requires is a encrypted genome set to be sent to an algorithm for evaluation to determine whether you have a cancer or not, or have one of 12 different types of cancer or not. And do that in an entire end-to-end encrypted format and tell us how long it took, how much memory it used, and how precise your results were. Cool thing is, Inpher was able to do it in under a second for about 900 individuals, and a range of other teams were able to do it between 3 seconds and 300 seconds. So it's a great dispersion in performance. We love to show that our current approach for fully homomorphic encryption is fastest and most precise. And in track 3, I think there was a use case around actually training a model. So training a model in a federated sense, not necessarily with federated learning or secure multi-party computation, which people kind of blend the difference. Federated is just a distributed, private machine learning problem to then train that model. So train the prediction model for cancer detection, and also use differential privacy layers on the back end to make sure that it's secure and not enabling the identification of any individual that might have been in the data set itself, which an algorithm was trained on. So same kind of concept, how fast can you do it? How much memory, how much bandwidth, how much CPU are you using? Everybody operates on a standard processor, a standard chipset, and some independent academics collaborate to put together the results and all report back. I think mostly what it is it's a forum for everyone working in this space to continue to come together and be informed of really intriguing and interesting use cases that are relevant for the technology, and then kind of show down and show off. Most appealing is after the contest results, every team gets together and puts on a presentation for 10 or 20 minutes about how they did it, what technique they used. So there's a lot of sharing and education that happens. And we love it because it's a great forum to go out for a test track with what we build at Inpher outside of our customer engagements and kind of publicize some of the capabilities that we've developed, but also that others in the market have developed.
And so the categories that are being judged on is both a response time and a precision component, as well as I think there's a couple of other components.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the track. A secure enclave track is going to evaluate one differently than a homomorphic track might. But largely in the homomorphic track, they're looking at speed and precision. So how long did it take you to ingest this data, end to end? How long did it take to encrypt it on the client side, send it to a server, have that server evaluate it homomorphically, send back a homomorphic result, and unencrypt that into plain text and evaluate it? End to end, doing that for about 900 individuals. So if you think about batch predictions, how long would it take to run batch predictions today via an API? This is kind of moving in that same realm. And what's appealing, at least for us in the solution space, is you can run batch predictions on almost 1,000 people in 1 second. And for a lot of real world use cases, that is performant enough. But as seen in some of the results, there are other homomorphic approaches that take a minute to run the same problem. So depending upon how you configure it and how you implement it, there's an order of magnitude difference, or 2 orders of magnitude perhaps difference in the performance of the underlying approaches. And that's what really people come to iDash to see, is what are the best of breed capabilities that are out there, and what are people doing to continue to innovate and push the boundaries of this capability being faster and more performant.
I was reading about the competition. I just found it so enriching. I encourage anybody to look at it, because even just understanding how they're grading the different features and different use cases, it sheds so much light and much more depth on how somebody who's making a purchasing decision should evaluate it. If you're looking to evaluate these technologies, what better place to gain some knowledge from than one of these competitions and how they're grading it? Can you tell me about the NYS DFS Tech Sprint?
Well, the DFS Tech Sprint is coming up in March. Probably our participation in tech sprints, and there was a really popular one 2 summers ago put on by the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. So the FCA put on a tech sprint specific to this with more of an AML KYC lens. And it's always unique how regulators want to call it a tech sprint, not a hackathon, but that's actually what it is. It's a hackathon. It's, hey, here's a problem. What could we cobble together as an innovative idea across a group of distinct teams that would move us forward? And my understanding is the DFS is doing something similar later this quarter, focused a bit more on regulatory reporting within the DeFi or the crypto space. So things like cross-market surveillance or general regulatory reporting. How can we overcome some of the challenges in the existing financial services space to make DeFi or crypto a bit more advanced? So I think we'll probably intend to participate. I know the team from Inpher is expecting to participate. And we've got some great ideas that could modernize the way that regulatory reporting happens through the use of privacy enhanced technologies. And these types of events are great forums to kind of begin that discussion, to pull together a group of different stakeholders, whether they be banks themselves, regulators as well, along with technologists like Infer, and even the legal and other spaces to ideate and even prototype what a solution could look like. And for us at Infer, what a great opportunity to kind of map our technology into quite well-known problem statements and see if it's a good fit for what a future state for regulatory reporting could look like. But the tech sprints are not more than that. They're great forums to kind of bring together a bunch of folks. They're not sales activities. They're not true product development. It's really the beginning stages of some of these conversations we at least have with customers. But it's really important because in all of our engagements, whether they be in financial services, health and life science, or elsewhere, at some point along the lines, a question comes up that sounds like this. This is cool. What do the regulators think of it? And a lot of times the answer is, well, they haven't yet really thought about it, voiced an opinion, written a policy, or blessed it, or otherwise. That's starting to change. Activities like these tech sprints help, but so does the continual evaluation of privacy in the data space. Most recently, I think, to change a little bit of this has been a month or two ago, just at the tail end of last year, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, the old Article 29 working paper group, put out some suggested supplementary measures to comply with GDPR on cross-border data requirements. So, hey, this data has to stay resident in Europe. And if you transfer data, you have to comply with these rules. One of the unique things is one PET, Secure-Multiparty Computation, or really namely multi-party computation, was mentioned as a suggested measure by the EDPB. And that's quite appealing. Now, will that manifest into some final suggestions and final rulings? Perhaps. They had an open solicitation for comment earlier this year, which will probably trickle into what they publicize. But it's starting to feel like it might be tipping, or at least at an inflection point, where regulators are beginning to pay attention to some of these coming technologies that could solve what they know to be pretty well-studied problems around data privacy, data residency, data ownership, et cetera, that I think pets have a lot to say about. But for a number of reasons, they're not really on the radar of every regulator that's out there today. And things like this podcast, tech sprints, and a general growing space perhaps help change the tide on that.
You look at something like the CAT, the Consolidated Audit Trail, that collects data across all markets, all orders for regulators, the origins of that group, the amount of money, time, and effort that's been spent on it. And from a security perspective, it's still lacking. And those components have been raised, and there's cost concerns and everything else. And unfortunately, by design, by the time CAT is fully operationalized, from a security perspective, it's going to be deficient. And it is begging for, in my view, for privacy enhancing technologies. But I think it's so far down the road, it's going to be difficult to get it right. Maybe I'll have somebody who's involved in the security side of the CAT come on the show and school me a bit. But it certainly doesn't seem like it's incorporated some of the more cutting edge technologies. And so I wonder, in the emerging crypto space, when you look at the rules like FinCEN and FATF and what they're mandating or they're offering guidance for in terms of what needs to be collected from an AML perspective, it may be an opportunity to get it right. Because certainly the privacy enhancing components of just using cryptocurrency in general, you can dismiss it. People can dismiss it, say anti-money laundering or that it's used by terrorists, what have you. But there are also legitimate privacy concerns underlying it, and addressing it while also simultaneously addressing some of the bad actors. That would be truly forward thinking.
I agree on all of it, from CAT to the future state. I think with CAT, the train's left the station, but it's a very slow train. But it's got a lot of cars and a lot of baggage, perhaps, so that when that gravity starts moving, it's moving. I also think that if, kind of really deeply looked at, privacy enhanced tech is perhaps not yet ready for CAT given the compute requirements. I mean, if you think about CAT for true cross-market surveillance, we're talking about billions of transactions a day, lots of flowing data in large, large quantities. Yes, unfortunate that it's going to be centralized in a central repository that's perhaps somewhat government run. Think of SolarWinds, you think of a honeypot. I mean, that's a really intriguing honeypot to approach with a lot of different cross-market trade and intelligence there. But it's needed for some regulatory capabilities for all of the surveillance reasons we want. I think there's a way in the future to kind of have our cake and eat it too. Can we have that analytical surveillance capability while keeping data private and distributed? Yeah, that's a lot of what pets are angled at. Now, doing it again 2.0 with a crypto cat would be pretty interesting. Is it possible? Is it what the market wants? Is the tech ready for that today as well? All open questions. But the answer is starting to move based on a lot of what you're talking about, what we're talking about, what the market is working on. It's closer and closer to reality. Now, does it go back someday to general CAT, the consolidated audit trail? I don't know. Reworking architecture is difficult. I think more fundamentally, though, you have to determine whether you want a decentralized or a centralized approach to the analytic environment. And it seems like, at least with DeFi, decentralized analytics might match a bit more than they did when CAT was kind of ideated or mandated in its early days.
Well, great. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I can't believe that the time has just flown by, and but it's been great to have you on the show and to talk. So where can people learn more about you and Inpher, Twitter handle, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to chat. Inpher.io for the company. Smoke signals, email, all that stuff. I'm Kevin at Inpher.io. I'd love to chat with anybody who gives us a listen and says we're full of it or has interesting questions. Let's talk more encrypted economy and hopefully secret computing.
Excellent. Well, thanks again.
Thanks, Eric. Pleasure to be here.